Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for hanging out with us today. My name is Adrian San Miguel. I'm a principal partner enterprise architect here at AWS, and I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Mike. Say hello, Mike, and introduce yourself.
Hello, Adrian. It's great to see you again.
Likewise.
We worked together in a bunch of stuff in the past, so that's great.
hmm
I'm a principal business development lead for AWS Outposts, so I'm the global BD lead.
Awesome. Glad to be talking shop with you again, Mike. It feels like it's too long, and it only seems we ever get to hang out around reInvent.
Yeah.
So, we've heard loud and clear from customers that they have data residency, data sovereignty top of mind. Would love to hear your thoughts about it, given your position and what you've been doing these days.
It's true. So for many years, we've heard that customers really want to continue running certain workloads on-prem or in certain sovereignty jurisdictions. And for a lot of our enterprise customers, they've had long-standing security concerns about moving certain workloads to the cloud. And in those cases that aren't necessarily regulated in nature, they've oftentimes found over time that using the AWS cloud can actually be more secure than running on premises because we just continue to make investments in security. But it's loud and clear that the regulatory environment, the data sovereignty restrictions that many of our customers are facing now are now growing, and they're continuing to propagate globally. And this is a very real constraint on how and where you can run your workloads. And basically, you think of I need a data set to remain within my country borders, or I need to run my workload in a certain location. I mean, there's nuances to that I'll get to.
hmm
And it's such an important part of our customers' businesses that we've actually made a pledge at our CEO level, the
Okay.
Digital Sovereignty Pledge. And you can see a blog post here from November where we initially talked about that. It's really a commitment to continuing to invest in this area for our customers.
That's fantastic. And if memory serves correct about that, didn't we just do something about the pledge and kind of announce a new service around that?
Yeah, we absolutely did. Thanks for reminding me. First a little background on the pledge. So
Yeah,
the
please.
pledge is basically saying that with all the security investments we've made, we now have some of the most security sensitive workloads in the world are running in the AWS regions today. And so we've developed a deep understanding of the sovereignty landscape, security requirements. We've invested in accreditations, and all these things to give customers control over their data. And we're going to continue to work with customers, with the pledge, we're going to continue to work with customers and regulators to really deeply understand that evolving landscape. And we're going to be innovating on behalf of our customers so they can continue to take advantage of the cloud without compromising on their compliance or the capabilities and performance and scalability of the workloads that they count on with AWS. But the thing you mentioned,
hmm
which is a new service offering, we just announced literally a week ago
Yeah.
the dedicated local zones. Okay, and so that was something from last week that Matt Garman talked about, and I encourage you to go read this blog post and understand more about it. And the idea here is that if a large multi-tenant customer comes to us with a need to run a private AWS environment, for example, a secure shared services offering being run for a community of government agencies, or maybe a large-scale SaaS offering that operates with really sensitive workloads, we can deliver and manage a local zone specifically for that customer or that community of customers with special security features. So check out that blog post and you'll hear more about it probably at reInvent this year. It's an exciting offering for us.
Yeah, I'd say so. And, Mike, you talked about how sovereignty regulations, despite what some folks may think, are going to vary across industry, vertical, customer, in just about every manifestation. But I thought this was just about keeping data in one specific place. Can you help elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, if you get into the actual language of the regulations, you'll start to see a lot of variation that architects need to pay attention to. Yes, everyone's familiar with the model of the data needs to be here, okay? And that wouldn't be unusual for, say, a healthcare workload
hmm
where PHI needs to stay inside a country's borders.
Yep.
The details that tend to vary in the regulatory frameworks are things like disaster protection. There's a lot of cases where you can actually use AWS Regions for backup, for data protection, for failover. I'll give you an example of Vietnam, where only a primary copy of the data needs to remain in the country.
Okay.
So you can actually implement true hybrid architectures between the edge and the cloud that make a lot of sense in those areas. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we might have a more extreme customer sensitivity that requires the ability to operate with complete network isolation, right? We'll call that air gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that imposes yet another set of constraints that we can work with. So given our visibility into a lot of different regulatory situations over the last few years, we've identified 7 common patterns. I like to call it the 7 faces of sovereignty, but it's, we've learned to use these patterns as guidance for our solution architects as we think about walking our customers through those application migrations. And you can see where on one end of the spectrum we have regulations not defined yet. In other, there's another class of sovereignty jurisdictions where data doesn't need to be in a specific country, but it needs to stay within a community of countries that share the same regulatory framework, so so on and so forth. And so a lot of this is being kind of codified in terms of in architectural principles that we can bring to our customers.
Awesome. So for the typical workload that we're talking about here, what do these applications look like? Are they just mostly lift and shift legacy workloads, or is it just kind of a hodgepodge and something else?
Yeah, I mean, logically, if you think about it, a lot of these workloads formerly and continuously governed by digital sovereignty are coming from legacy platforms. So a lot of them tend to be basic virtualized database workloads that have been replatformed to AWS and AWS Linux on EC2. And some are starting to take advantage of containers to get that flexibility that the cloud offers on services like EKS. But there's a different conversation when we get into, say, industry-specific controls, and we see regulatory frameworks around specific industries and specific data types.
Okay.
And that's because the regulators in these cases want to protect key intellectual property for sensitive industries or nationally important industries. And so one example might be a Middle Eastern country where it's perfectly fine to send healthcare data into an AWS region, but oil and gas exploration data, no, that's very sensitive and needs to be kept within the country's borders. And so we're seeing similar examples in, say, semiconductor, GIS and mapping information, for example. And so in these sorts of cases, we'll actually see complete workflows, production, edit, scale, simulation, high performance computing that all have to run within that sovereignty domain. And as well as I do that, like a semiconductor EDA workload is a completely different animal than an enterprise database, SQL Server, Windows SQL Server workload. And so RSAs have learned to be pretty flexible in adopting different architectural patterns where we need to.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Yeah. Let's see. So one of the industries that's growing super fast is what we call real money gaming, and some of you are very familiar with that. But think of that as the sports betting, online casinos, and areas like this. It actually turns out that some of the strongest sovereignty regulations are right here at home,
Really?
In the USA, where there's regulations around the striking of the bet, that the transaction has to happen within state borders. And I call that out because there's a case where it's less about control of the data and it's more about where the transaction takes place. So there's another variation on how sovereignty influences the architectural patterns. What's interesting about this is in addition to complying with the regulatory frameworks, these customers are very sensitive to being able to land and launch their businesses in new jurisdictions efficiently and quickly. And so why don't we take a pause?
Yeah, please.
I queued up a video about Betson, which is one of our customers, and they talk a little bit about both things, right? Both the regulatory compliance as well as how do you move fast and efficiently and scale into these jurisdictions.
Yeah, would love to see it.
The Betson Group is a global iGaming operator. We operate more than 20 brands in more than 10 jurisdictions around the world. We deliver everything from casino to live casino, horse racing, and of course our sportsbook. So, since we are a global operator, we needed a partnership with someone who has presence in all the regions where we operate today and regions where we will operate. So partnering up with AWS gave us the possibility to both use the AWS Regions and also technologies such as the AWS Outposts where regions are not present. For our sportsbook, that is really compute heavy and it also needs a lot of real-time data. We needed to be as close as possible to the customers. We have our back office and the traders that set up the game, that actually make sure that we have the right price on the bids and so on, are located in Malta. Spanning over to where we actually have a real-time feed, which is the AWS region in Frankfurt. From there, we feed the live data over to the US East 1 AWS Cloud region. And in state, in Colorado where we operate, we have the AWS Outposts. So we can have data in the state that never leaves state border, but we pair them up then on top of everything with AWS CloudFront to make sure that we have quick and easy access to the data as close to the customers as possible. The benefits we get with utilizing all of the AWS technologies that we did for our sportsbook is that, first of all, we don't need to have the people ourselves to operate these type of solutions across the world in different time zones. It also gives us much faster time to market because we don't need to order and set it up ourselves. This is actually handled by the AWS personnel. So when we release our products, for us it's just code and we extend the availability zone to the next AWS outpost that we set up. We can free up our internal resources. They can put that effort into making sure our end customer actually get the experience they so much need and work on getting into new regions, setting up new brands, and also, of course, releasing new products. To deliver entertainment, you have to work with people. And working with the great staff at AWS as well helps us a lot. So it's not just about servers or anything like that. It's all about the people in the end.
That's pretty amazing, Mike. I wish I had something to say, but I'm kind of speechless.
Well, it's a pretty common pattern across a lot of the customers in the digital sovereignty space. So that was a great, set of examples, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess just one last thing on your question is we do see a lot of rapid pace of change in the regulatory frameworks, not just in real money gaming where things are being deregulated right and left, but also in emerging markets, for example. In African countries, we're seeing a lot of new digital sovereignty policies. And some of them are trying to emulate what we've seen elsewhere in the world, but some of them are trying to think of net new things that they can do to protect their national IP.
Yeah, awesome. It sounds like we are well on their way to helping them achieve that type of digital transformation as they make their way through, I guess, what can be called a pretty nascent digital journey. But it's a pretty good segue. $1 million question. How are customers actually meeting these sovereignty requirements by using AWS services?
Yeah, and earlier today you've heard a lot of details on the specific service. I'm not going to go too deep on the specific services, but the theme, one of the common architectural themes that we're really focused on is how to extend out our managed services beyond the boundaries of our large public regions, with a particular focus on what we would consider to be our foundational AWS services. So EC2, EBS storage, S3 storage, RDS, containers, VPC networking, et cetera. So Akshata talked a little bit about AWS Outposts in the last session. That's, of course, my favorite service because I've been involved in that for a long time. The way to think about Outposts is where, and there's a great picture here of an actual rack that we've got deployed somewhere, can't tell you where, but we think of taking this rack of compute and storage capacity and dragging it out of one of our regional data centers and moving it into the customer's data center and connecting it over a long wire. Basically, we would call that our control plane linkage back to the AWS region. Okay, and that allows us to project that consistency of not just EC2 and EBS and VPC networking, but also the higher level cloud services. And once that outpost is in place, now the data can stay where it needs to stay. The workload runs where it needs to run, and the customer can meet their requirements. I guess one of the important things we have to remind customers is that it's not, they shouldn't consider it to be a hardware offering. We have no intention of just selling hardware. It's really a fully managed pool of capacity and cloud services. Now, what are the, I mean, we'll come back to the benefits a little bit later, but now you get the same pane of glass, the same control plane services like logging and identity management, and dropping the same AMIs that can run anywhere. So I'm making it super easy for developers. And in fact, I would say our kind of measure of success is when a developer doesn't even need to know if their app is running in one of our regions or in an outpost that might be down the hall in their own data center. Okay, so then as we see more and more demand for these kinds of use cases for, say, outposts in specific locations, we started accelerating our deployment of local zones. And so, here's a map of where we are in local zones.
Okay.
We're up to 52 locations where we're either already deployed or in some state of, currently deploying a new local zone. The way to think about local zones is they're a lot like an availability zone in one of our existing regions, but we take it and we can stretch it maybe as far as 1,000 kilometers away from that AWS region into one of these jurisdictions or sovereignty domains. And it's fully managed AWS infrastructure. And so we don't share a lot of details of the underlying engineering, but if you were to look into one of those data centers, you might see what looks like a lot of outposts stacked up. So we're able to leverage a lot of the same engineering investments, and that's allowing us to move very quickly into some of these emerging markets. So we absolutely have used local zones to help customers very quickly overcome some of these data sovereignty regulations. And then lastly, I already mentioned dedicated local zones and talked about that a little bit, but think of it as a local zone with special security and privacy protections wrapped around it for very specific customers. There are lots of other services that are hybrid and our customers can use, like EKS Anywhere you heard about earlier today, that can run on their own infrastructure. And that's always an option as well.
Oh, awesome. But, something I know a lot of customers get stuck on that you made mention of. Outpost is really intended to be a connected service, functioning as an extension of that region, right? That doesn't violate any of these sovereignty restrictions at all, does it? And if not, would you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah, we get that question a lot, and it's a really important question to answer. Actually, both outposts and local zones operate as extensions of our AWS regions. They tether back to the AWS regions for that control plane service, for that consistency and how APIs respond to those developer calls and so forth. So you're right that the management of our infrastructure there actually sits outside the sovereignty domain. But the answer is no, that generally speaking, this is not violating any of the data sovereignty regulations that we see out there. Because we can assure the customer and the regulators that the data is remaining in the outpost, in the local zone, and the application is operating in the right places. I guess we have to caveat by saying, unless the application is doing something right. So if a developer is, say, an application is taking a snapshot of an RDS database and sending the snapshot up to the AWS region where it's going into an S3 bucket, well, okay, that could violate a sovereignty regulation. So we have to make sure that the architecture is set up right. But fundamentally, the trade-off of having that consistency of operating as an extension of the AWS region, the benefits of that far outweigh any implication that service link has on kind of risk to your sovereignty position.
So it's absolutely imperative in that case for you as the customer to work with your account team to understand what that architecture needs to look like to map directly to what your sovereignty requirements are. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's
Awesome.
absolutely right.
Awesome. And I get this question constantly from folks. We are using Nitro for these, right?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Nitro is kind of misunderstood by a lot of our customers. But it really is fundamental to how we assure the security of the infrastructure in outposts and local zones, and how we maintain that really strong separation of like our monitoring mechanisms from the customer's application. And so Nitro, everyone should go read about Nitro if you don't know about Nitro. But Nitro is our hypervisor and security framework. And one of the key things it does for us, for example, in say outposts, is Nitro is assuring that there's 100% encryption of all the data at a hardware level, even if you want to implement encryption on top of that. Nitro provides tamper detection for us and a bunch of other capabilities to assure the security of the infrastructure.
Awesome. So it really sounds like we could get really into the weeds, and maybe I could ask to get a little deeper on some specific customers, if you're cool with that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to give some examples.
Yeah.
Like I said, some of the workloads that we see tend to be Windows, SQL Server
Hmm.
kinds of workloads, maybe single tenant workloads operating at the edge. Um, I would say under sovereignty regulations,
Hmm.
those sorts of workloads, we tend to see more of those traditional database architectures.
Fair.
High availability tends to become a bigger issue, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not able necessarily to back up the data to other sites or to the AWS regions. So let's look at a couple customers. So
Yeah,
we
please.
have in financial services, we have First Abu Dhabi Bank. In UAE, we have Absa Bank in South Africa.
Okay.
Both are running banking workloads on outposts and they're either B2C or internal banking workloads. They're generally deployed with two separate outposts and two separate data centers,
Okay.
with each outpost having a different network link back to the parent region. And so, we've worked with them to develop a very high availability architecture
Hmm.
that keeps their banking systems online. And this is something that we will work through with our customers in kind of workshops as we talk about networking workshops and
Hmm.
data center requirements and things like that.
Cool.
Okay. Another interesting pattern we've seen is it is possible to implement a hybrid workflow. So doing some things at the edge and some things in the core of the network. For example, disaster protection, which is allowed under some regulatory frameworks,
Hmm.
or some customers might apply masking to certain data if they want to build a data warehouse that's in
Hmm.
our regions. Those are good examples. Um, um, maybe for a data warehouse workload.
Yeah, yeah. No, that sounds almost like dedicated local zones was a response to some other pattern. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, typically we're talking about working backwards from certain specific workload requirements. But when you talk about dedicated local zones, typically we're talking about a community of requirements with a multi-tenant infrastructure, and that's a different kind of a sizing exercise that we do. And we might see at the same table citizen data, DoD workloads, tax agencies for like a federal community,
Yeah.
and it's much more of a private cloud, a kind of a sizing exercise.
Yeah, awesome. So it sounds like dedicated local zone can help solve a ton of their problems. And it's also great to understand how we can launch cloud services pretty much virtually anywhere the customer wants. But we still hear this a lot working together, right? Why wouldn't customers want to go back to traditional storage and compute to meet their sovereignty regulations? Like, why wouldn't they do that?
Yeah, first I would say that many of our customers serve a global market. Some of the customers are operating with clients in, say, tens of sovereignty domains, or they're planning on that kind of a growth. For a company like that, it would be a daunting investment to go operate in a remote country, hire staff, stand up infrastructure, deal with local currencies and service providers. For them, if they can use local zones or deploy on AWS Outpost and, say, a co-location site, that means AWS drops the infrastructure, they drop their AMIs, and they can be up and running with minimal cost to their business. Thinking back on the Betson case, that's kind of a classic example. These guys really are focused on time to market. How quickly can you get the infrastructure stood up and their applications running, especially when they have like a new state that's deregulating, like Kentucky,
Okay.
or an event like the Super Bowl coming up. Okay. I would say the next thing that we really should think about is the developer, the benefit to the developer, right? So we have a lot of enterprises where they have, one developer team that's focused on VMware and Windows Server and SQL Server, and then the kids down the hall, they get to play with the cloud and use cloud tools and move more quickly and use EKS and RDS and so forth. And what we're trying to get our customers to is a point where they can collapse those organizations and operate much more efficiently from a tools perspective, from a cloud services perspective. And so, First Abu Dhabi Bank, for example, told us that they're able to, after they kind of went through this transformation, moving these additional banking workloads to Outposts, they found that they were able to launch workloads or new applications about 50% more quickly.
Wow.
They were able to achieve dev efficiencies by about 60% improvement.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, so it was really profound benefits on the dev side once you can kind of get into that single shared environment. And then Lastly, and more importantly for some customers, is that when we're operating globally, having a single governance envelope is crucially important. That means IAM, logging, alerting, key management, enforcing your software versions, making sure that patching is consistent. If you find yourself breaking up your global business from site to site, and in order to support these different um, um, regulatory domains in different locations with different MSPs and so forth, you really have to examine what you're doing. Okay.
No, that totally makes sense, Mike. And, it's kind of strange to see all of this emerging from sovereignty. It's a great conversation to have.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming onto the show, joining us today, Mike. And folks, you'll definitely want to stay tuned. We're going to be kind of changing gears a little bit and moving on to a session theme of bringing AWS to the edge. We'll be back after a short break and can't wait to see you.